Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. We have arrived at the end of this particular intellectual journey. Right, this will be my last lecture for this course. There's more to learn always. There's more I could lecture on. What I've decided is that I will focus on Book 3 and tell you about the first 5 chapters, and that will wrap up our discussion in a very helpful way, it seems to me. And in fact, there's a lot of contemporary resonance for this discussion, right? And I'll tell you why. So what we're covering here with the first 5 chapters of Book 3 is Aristotle's extended argument to show that virtue and vice are up to us, right? And then you might think, well, that doesn't sound like it has a lot of contemporary resonance. Well, we're still having a free will debate, so there's that. But yeah, I don't mean to say that this part of the text by itself has contemporary resonance. What I mean is we're coming back to this point that happiness is largely up to us, right? It's not entirely up to us, it's largely up to us. This is what Aristotle has claimed already as we go into Book 3, right? In Book 1, he argued that it's not appropriate for happiness to be a gift from the gods, right? It should be something that we can attain. He has also argued that happiness is largely up to us, specifically because it's virtuous activity of the rational part, right? But then for that to work, right, in order for it to follow, virtue needs to be up to us, right? In other words, let me say the whole thing again. He's inferring from the fact that happiness is largely based on virtue, that happiness is largely up to us, right? But then for that inference to work, virtue has to be up to us. So that's what I think has contemporary resonance. There's a whole field of psychology called positive psychology, and it's based on the premise that happiness is to a large extent, not entirely, up to us. And there's been a lot of research in this area. I would encourage you to find a book by Martin Seligman or someone else who's known for their work in positive psychology. This isn't the same as positive thinking. This is a branch of psychology. It's scientific, and it does actually study virtue, although the list of virtues is different from what Aristotle came up with. I already said he's a little conventional in his list of virtues. You can't necessarily trust the list, but he's got a good model of virtue, right? And positive psychologists are very interested in Aristotle. Now they're doing empirical work, so they're mainly interested in what they can study empirically, but Aristotle's work has been a driving force in that field. Okay, well anyway, this is what we're going to look at. I'll say a little bit about what we're not covering in this lecture. You were supposed to read some excerpts from Book 6, right? And that portion of text covers intellectual virtues. And so that'll round out your understanding of the virtues, right? You'll have a longer list. And I think it would be helpful for you to look at that, but I need to focus, and so I'm going to end with what I think is an appropriate ending for us. And then Book 10, I would be more interested in lecturing on Book 10 than Book 6 if I thought I had a lot of time. Book 10 is sort of in two parts, in a way. In the first part, Aristotle revisits pleasure. He already talked about it quite a bit at the end of Book 7, and that's because Book 7 has a lot to do with self-control versus temperance. He's trying to define self-control and the role that it plays in the virtuous life, but also distinguish it from temperance, right? And of course, temperance and self-control are largely about controlling pleasure. So then at the end of that book, there's a pretty rich discussion of pleasure. Then in Book 10, he picks it up again, and some of the discussion is redundant and some of it seems to add something to the earlier discussion. The only thing I want to say here about pleasure is that it's a supervenient end, or you might say it's a bit of a bonus, right? And when I say end, I mean goal. In other words, pleasure is not the good, right? We already knew that from a lot of different argumentation. But it's a bonus good that sort of sits on top of good activities, and that's why I used the word supervene. So it turns out whenever you're doing an activity that flows from a part of you that's in good condition and you're not impeded, in other words, the activity isn't somehow degraded or impaired either by external conditions or by the condition that you're in, it comes with pleasure. So seeing comes with pleasure. It's an unimpeded activity of a part of us, right? And going for a run, at least if you get in shape, I used to run, comes with pleasure, right? If you're not in shape, then it's impeded, right? It does fit Aristotle's model, to be clear. And I'm going to the trouble of telling you this part so I can explain the rest of Book 10 clearly enough. The second half of Book 10 involves saying more concretely what a happy life is like, what a good life is like. Those are the same thing, right? And naturally, virtue comes into it. And we sort of get these two lives, but we can also think of them as different aspects of one good life, and probably that's the way Aristotle would prefer to look at it. But there's a life of practical virtue that involves being courageous and temperate and generous and magnificent. The list that we looked at already. There's a life of action that involves exercising those virtues, right? And if the exercise of those virtues is not impeded, then that's pleasant. So the good life isn't a life of pleasure. It's not based on pleasure, but the life of unimpeded practical virtue is very pleasant. Right? And then the flip side, the other kind of good life, is the life of contemplation, right? That's the activity of your rational part. And you could spend a life thinking about the highest things, metaphysics, of course, is what Aristotle is thinking of, theology, philosophy more generally. Right, you could spend your life thinking about these things, mathematics, geometry as well, right? And the more you learn, the more you can contemplate without interruption. If you've already absorbed a lot of information, you can sort of sit and think about it and put it together in novel ways, and you get more and more unimpeded as you go along, right? So again, that's a very pleasant life, right? So in a sense, there are two lives here modeled for us at the end, the life of practical virtue, the life of intellectual virtue, which is also the life of contemplation. That's just another name for the same thing. But, Aristotle also hints here and there, look, you're a human being, not a god. He speaks highly of the gods here at the end. You're a human being, not a god. You have to live among people. You have social needs. Right? You're going to have to exercise the practical virtues. So the life of contemplation is best, but you can't expect to live a life where you don't exercise the practical virtues. So there is a vision of some kind of combined life here, right, where you exercise the practical virtues quite a bit. You have sort of this minimum amount of wealth, whatever you really need to be temperate and courageous and generous and all of that sort of thing, right? But, you try to spend your time pondering, contemplating, right? Because that's really the best thing. So basically this is a life of study, but one that doesn't neglect the community, right? And one's obligations to the community. All right, so I hope that's a helpful vision, but yeah, now let's focus on book 3. So let's go broad first and then be more specific. So in chapter 1, Aristotle defines what voluntary actually means, right? He's going to argue that virtue and vice are up to us. That's the broad trajectory of the argumentation. So it makes sense for him to start out defining what is voluntary and what is involuntary. And he's got a short list of things that make action involuntary, right? And then voluntary action is sort of the opposite of that, as we'll see when we get into the details. Chapter 2 is about decision. Okay, now your textbook says deliberative choice, which is a mouthful, but that means the same as decision, so I'm just going to say decision. That's a perfectly good translation for what Aristotle is talking about. Okay, and then the main finding, I would say, of chapter 2 is that decision is a desire that is caused by a process of deliberation. Right, so we have different kinds of desires, and some of them are natural, but decision is a rational desire. It depends on a rational process that you go through, and that process is deliberation. So then chapter 3 is about deliberation, and chapter 3 tries to clarify what we deliberate about, what we don't deliberate about, right? And then this sort of sets up, I'm sort of skipping chapter 4 for a second, I'll come back to it. This sort of sets up chapter 5 pretty well, where we realize that the very sorts of things that we deliberate about and then make decisions about are the things that virtue and vice are about, right? In other words, whatever virtue and vice are governing, a certain realm of action and feeling, that's what we deliberate and decide about, right? And then whatever we decide on, Aristotle has argued by this point, that's voluntary. It fits the definition of voluntary that was given in chapter 1. So that's how everything fits together, seems to me, and I hope that'll be clear by the end. Now I skipped chapter 4. Chapter 4 tells us about wish, and wish plays a minor role here, but I will say something about chapter 4, and I'll say something about wish right now. What is the role that wish plays in all of this? Well, as Aristotle puts it eventually, you don't quite deliberate about the end or the goal. You lay down the end or the goal. You sort of take it for granted, and then you deliberate about the best way to achieve the end or goal. So in a specific process of deliberation, you take the end for granted, or you take the goal for granted. So where does that goal come from? Well, that's something you wish for. So wish, like decision, comes from the rational part, but unlike decision, it doesn't result from a process of deliberation. It just results from our recognition that something is good. If we recognize that something is good, that's why the rational part's involved, right? We're putting something under a concept, and the concept is goodness. So when we recognize something is good, then we will wish for it, right? Unless there's some other consideration that's preventing us, but sort of all things being equal, no caveats, no qualifications, just setting those aside. Generally, if we recognize something is good, then we wish for it because of the recognition that it's good, right? And so then we can take that for granted and start a process of deliberation about how to get that good thing, which will result in a decision, which, if everything's okay with us, will result in action, and we'll actually begin to pursue that good thing. One step at a time. When we deliberate, we tend to create steps to follow. We'll get to that. Okay, so that's the big picture. Okay, so now let's look at Chapter 1 of Book 3, which I've already said is about voluntary and involuntary action. So Aristotle starts by making a really basic point. Virtue is about feelings and actions. These receive praise and blame if they are voluntary, so we must examine the voluntary. Right, so voluntary actions and voluntary feelings are praised or blamed. And then the flip side of that is, well, what's involuntary we could excuse if it needs to be excused, or we could just ignore it. But our praise and blame are focused on the voluntary, right? And certainly we're in an ethical field, an ethical area of inquiry when we're looking at what's typically praised and blamed, or so it would seem, right? Okay, so let's look at the voluntary. Aristotle tells us how it seems, and often he tells us how it seems, and then he rejects how it seems eventually, or he makes refinements. But actually, in this particular case, in Chapter 1, he tells us how it seems, and then he just defends how it seems. He doesn't really alter what he says at the beginning. And what he says is, now it seems that things coming about by force or because of ignorance are involuntary. So he's going to stick with that. He's going to refine it and give us more detail. But basically, if something comes about by force or it's caused by ignorance, then it's involuntary. So we just have to define what it is for an action to be forced and what it is for an action to be caused by ignorance, and then we'll understand the involuntary, and then we'll understand the voluntary as the opposite of that. Okay. So he says, what is forced has an external principle, the agent contributes nothing. And he sticks to that. And there's a lot of nuanced discussion here, but I need you to understand that he sticks to what he says at the beginning. Force is a high bar, right? He says the agent contributes nothing. He absolutely sticks to that. So something that's forced is something you really don't have any control over, and it's even a strain to call it a forced action, because usually when we say action, we mean something you're somehow responsible for. But he's saying, look, sometimes you're forced to do something and you're not responsible at all and you didn't contribute. And he's going to call it forced action. But the sort of thing that counts as a clear example, and he says things like this. He says, well, So some people could just carry you off. Some people could barge into my office and carry me to the student center. And that would be forced, and therefore it would be involuntary. So we could say Dr. Jeff Ogle went to the student center involuntarily, right? And again, we kind of want to say, well, that isn't even an action. And that's true, but it has to be that kind of force in order for Aristotle to call it involuntary in an unqualified way. Okay, but then we get into the qualifications, right? And they do make things complicated, but they don't change the basic picture. Let's try to stay high level, I guess. Basically, Aristotle wants to distinguish coercion from force, and so he basically says some actions are coerced, and his primary example, seems to me, is, well, you're in a ship out at sea and you've got some cargo and it's really precious cargo, and you wouldn't want to throw it overboard, of course, right? But then things are quite stormy and you think, wow, we should really jettison this cargo, so the ship doesn't capsize. We're carrying too much weight. Now, I'm not a captain. I don't know if that's really the right thing to do. It probably depends on the kind of storm. But anyway, that's the example. So that sort of thing is coerced, but it's not forced. He's willing to call it a mixed action. It has the appearance of being involuntary, but in principle, it is voluntary. So what does that mean? Well, it has the appearance of being involuntary in the sense that, well, the cargo is valuable, and of course you wouldn't want to throw it out, right? Wouldn't. Under normal circumstances, you wouldn't want to do it, so it has the look of the involuntary. You didn't want to. However, under the particular conditions that obtained, the storm was really bad. It looked like we could get through it if we threw the cargo overboard, so we'll get to live if we throw the cargo overboard, and we'll probably die if we don't. Under those specific conditions, it is rational to throw the cargo overboard, and it is even desirable, right? And so really, the action is voluntary. Because as he says, I meant to say, action is about particulars. Action is in a particular context. It responds to a particular context. It tries to achieve something particular. So action is about particulars, as he says. So if it looks voluntary when we take the particulars into account, then it really is voluntary. Because it has the appearance of the involuntary, then we'll call it mixed, right? And so there is some confusing phrasing here, and I guess I should address it, although, yeah, it's confusing, so I'm going to confuse things even by bringing it up. So if you look at the situation in an unqualified way, then the action looks involuntary. But then when you qualify the situation, meaning you bring up all the caveats and all the particulars, then we see that the action is voluntary. And so I know it sounds like, I admit, it sounds like Aristotle is saying it's really involuntary because he's using that word unqualified, right? And sometimes when we say unqualified, we mean absolute. It's absolutely true that it was involuntary. That's just not how he's using that word here. He's saying that if we ignore circumstances, then the action is involuntary, right? just like giving a ransom, he mentions some kind of ransom situation, so I might as well give a second example here. Someone has my parents, say, and they want a ransom, or they're not going to give my parents back, and so I have to come up with a bunch of money. So if we look at it in an unqualified way, we don't look at what I'm trying to achieve, we don't look at the particulars. That's involuntary if I give them the money, because why would I? Of course, I don't want to part with that money. But then when we look at the particulars, I was trying to get my parents back and save them from harm. Well, then we see that it's voluntary. So the phrasing here is weird, but the qualified situation is what matters, and that's because action is about particulars and has to do with particulars. So the truer account is the one that involves the particulars, and then as we get more abstract and pan out, the action looks involuntary, but that's a less true vision of the situation. Okay? So again, he really just sticks to this point that, well, sure, an action is involuntary if it's forced, but forced means you contributed absolutely nothing. Now, there are coerced actions as well, which we were just saying, but those are voluntary. Okay, and so you're responsible. Now, he does admit sometimes you're stretched so far. The kidnapper has my parents and my kids, and I don't know, all of my ancient philosophy students. Let's just throw that in there, right? And they're going to come to harm if I don't give up all my money, right? If we thought it was a bad thing for me to capitulate to the kidnappers, maybe we do, maybe we don't. Even if we thought it was a bad thing for me to give in and yield and do what the kidnappers want, I think we would excuse me and say I was sort of overstretched there. Like I couldn't take that much pressure, right? So the action is voluntary, and Aristotle never takes it back, but he does eventually concede that some voluntary actions could be excused even when we think, in theory they're blameworthy. He shouldn't have done that. She shouldn't have done that. We can look at the level of coercion and say, okay, I understand, right? Or, wow, they really shouldn't have thrown that cargo overboard. It was so valuable, but man, they thought they were going to die. So I understand. They were stretched too far. They couldn't take it. They had to throw it overboard, or they felt like they did. Okay, so we understand force. What about the ignorance part? Well, one thing we want to do is we want to distinguish things that are caused by ignorance from things that are done in ignorance. If it's caused by ignorance, that means you're not the cause. It's the fault lies with the state of ignorance and not with you. If something is done in ignorance, you're still the problem. It's your fault. So what do I mean by that? What kinds of things are done in ignorance? Well, if you don't know things you're supposed to know, then we'll say, well, it was done in ignorance, but it wasn't caused by ignorance. The real cause was the agent was negligent, right? So you're supposed to know that you should drive on the right side of the road, right? You have to go through training to get a driver's license, right? You have to take a test, and you have to show that you know that sort of thing. So if you drive on the left side of the road and cause an accident, and then you say, but I didn't know I was supposed to drive on the right side of the road, well, we're not going to let you off the hook. We're going to say, well, maybe you forgot or something, but you need to know that. You're supposed to, you shouldn't be driving if you don't know that, right? Or I didn't know I couldn't remove the candle from the church, right? I thought there were free candles there in the church, so I took one. That's not really excusable ignorance, right? If you're a churchgoer, right, then you should know what the candles are for. If you're not a churchgoer, then why are you just randomly doing things and not consulting someone with knowledge, right? So something is done in ignorance when the ignorance is basically, Aristotle ends up saying, of the universal or beneficial. And then more concretely, we could say, well, if it's ignorance of the sort of thing you're supposed to know, that might be a more helpful way to put it. If it's that kind of ignorance, then you're not off the hook. So it's done in ignorance. It's not caused by ignorance. It's caused by your negligence or your neglect or something like that. Okay, so that kind of action is voluntary, because you voluntarily didn't bother to get the information you should have had. And then drunkenness and extreme anger also fall into this category. If you do something in extreme anger, you may not really be aware what you're doing. You may not know how hard you're pushing on something, etc. But that's done in ignorance. That's not caused by ignorance. And it's the same reasoning. Well, why didn't you work on your anger? Why didn't you develop the virtue of mildness? Right? You shouldn't have let yourself get so angry. Obviously, works the same with drunkenness. Why did you get so drunk that you didn't know what you were doing anymore, right? So you're the cause, done in ignorance but not caused by ignorance. The only way for something to be caused by ignorance is for there to be a blameless ignorance of particulars, right? There could be particulars in the situation that you don't know about, and then generally we wouldn't say that you're supposed to know all the particulars of a situation. So this fits with the other point that, well, sometimes you should know, right? Usually if it's not the case that you should know, there's just some particular that's different from what a reasonable person would have expected. The kind of example Aristotle gives is, well, I didn't know the catapult was loaded, right? It could happen that way. Your friend could tell you, your reliable friend that you've relied on many times, could tell you the catapult's not loaded, and then you fire the catapult. No, you damaged something. It was loaded, right? You could be an actor, and unfortunately this sort of thing has happened. You could be an actor, and the stage manager could hand a gun to you, and it's supposed to have a blank in it, right? And you're relying on the stage manager to check, right? You're not the gun expert. You're handed a gun, told to fire, right? And you've even come to depend on the stage manager, but then maybe there's a real bullet in the gun. Now, obviously, Aristotle doesn't mention guns, but he gives a lot of examples like this. Like he talks about, you thought there was a tip on the spear, that you thought there was a little cap on the end that would keep it from piercing something, and you threw it. That's the kind of example he gives here. Or, you were sparring and you hit too hard, you didn't know how hard you were hitting. That's the sort of ignorance we can excuse. Ignorance of some irrelevant particular, right? And Aristotle says, he lists a bunch of particulars, but he also says the most important of these particulars are what the agent is doing and the result for which he does it or she does it, right? I think the way to think about, the result part is obvious. Like, you didn't know what the result was going to be. You fired the catapult. First of all, you didn't know there was ammo in it, and then you didn't know that the result would be that somebody's property was damaged, right? But why does he say, what the agent is doing is one of the most important particulars? Don't you have to know what you're doing? Well, the way to think about that is we can often give different descriptions of actions that are equally valid and accurate. In other words, trying to think of a good example here. Going back to the gun case, right? I guess we'll just go back to that. I knew I was firing a weapon, right? If we get general enough, I knew what I was doing. But then I thought I was firing a gun with a blank in it, but actually I was firing a loaded gun, loaded with a real bullet, right? So then in some sense I didn't know what I was doing, right? And that's because under one description I knew what I was doing, probably multiple descriptions I knew what I was doing. I knew I was acting, I was on screen, or I was being filmed or whatever. I was going to be on screen eventually is what I'm trying to say. So acting, doing my job, firing a weapon, right? There are various descriptions that fit what I was doing, and I knew those descriptions fit. But there is a relevant description, relevant to what ended up happening. I was firing a gun with a bullet in it, and I didn't know that. So then in a very important sense, I didn't know what I was doing. And notice how that's connected to the result, right? The result is somebody got shot in the arm. I'm trying not to make it too murderous. I don't want to give you a horrible example. Maybe I just wounded someone a little, thankfully. Right, but we can think of a scenario in which that's not the sort of thing I was supposed to know. I wasn't supposed to know there was a bullet in there, so I didn't know what I was doing in some sense, and that's why I didn't know what the result would be. Right, I didn't know I was firing a loaded catapult, and that's why I didn't know the wall was going to be damaged, etc. I didn't know I was hitting my opponent so hard when we were sparring, and that's why I didn't know I was going to actually wound him. Okay, something like that. All right, so I think we know what kind of ignorance gets us off the hook then. It's ignorance of relevant particulars. So to sum up what's involuntary, an action is involuntary if it's forced, which is a really high bar. The agent contributes nothing. Or it's caused by ignorance, which isn't such a high bar, but still you have to distinguish caused by ignorance from done in ignorance. If it's caused by ignorance, it's ignorance of the relevant particulars. So if one of those two things holds of your action, then it was involuntary. If it was forced, or if it was caused by ignorance of some relevant particular or particulars, then we'll say it's involuntary. So then, voluntary action, as Aristotle says, this is more or less a quote, voluntary action is what has its principle in the agent himself, knowing the particulars that constitute the action. So in other words, the agent is the cause, that's what he means by principle here, and the agent knows all the relevant particulars, and that that will count as voluntary. Okay, good. I think we handled that pretty well. So then we get to chapter 2, and we talk about decision and what is decision. Decision falls under the voluntary, but it has a more narrow scope. Okay, and we need to work on decision because obviously decision has something to do with ethics and virtue, and we're going to figure out what exactly as we keep talking about decision. Okay, so as Aristotle puts it, the decisions people make distinguish their characters pretty well. If we look at the decisions people make and how they made them, which invokes the process of deliberation, as we already know, that can tell us a lot about someone's state of virtue, about their character. Okay, so again, decision falls under the voluntary but has a narrower scope. How do we show that? Well, children and animals, non-human animals, share in the voluntary, but they don't share in decision, right? I mean, we wouldn't say that animals and little kids do everything involuntarily. We would say most of their actions are voluntary. But we wouldn't say, if they're very young children, right, we wouldn't say that their actions were based on decision. So decision is voluntary, but voluntary is broader than what's decided, basically, right? And then another thing Aristotle says about the distinction is, well, we can act voluntarily on the spur of the moment. Not everything we do spontaneously is involuntary. In fact, it seems most of it is voluntary, even though it's spontaneous and not well thought out, right? But what we do spontaneously that we didn't think about beforehand, clearly we didn't decide on. So again, decision is voluntary, but voluntary is a broader category. Okay, more specifically, more narrowly, decision isn't spirit and it's not appetite. And that's for similar reasons to what we already covered. Animals and young children have appetite, but they don't have decision, so we can just rule that out. Decision's not an appetite. And also, animals and young children have spirit, meaning, you know, they're capable of anger, they're capable of shame, they're capable of pride. Not every animal, but you know, the more social ones, dogs are capable of shame and pride, it seems to me, and even if they're not, some non-human animals are, right? So decision isn't spirit, and then there's, you know, this line of argument might sound odd. I don't know if it does or not. So let me explain. Why are we distinguishing decision from appetite and spirit? Maybe that seems like a weird thing to bother to do. What Aristotle is thinking about is motivational states in general. And he's thinking decision is a motivational state, and appetite is a motivational state, and spirit is a motivational state. So can I lump in decision with one of these other categories? Is decision some kind of appetite, or does it belong to spirit somehow? And so he's arguing against that, and that's because these are all motivational states, and he's just distinguishing the different motivational states from each other. I hope that makes some sense if you were wondering about that. Decision isn't wish, but it's like wish. I believe I already said wish and decision come from the rational part. I already defined wish a little bit. You just recognize that something is good, and so you want it for that reason, whereas decision follows deliberation. But we haven't gotten to that part of the text yet, so how are they distinguished here? Well, you can wish for impossible things. You could wish to fly without an airplane, say, or you could wish to live forever, and Aristotle considers those impossible things, but you could wish for them. You can't decide on them. It doesn't make any sense to decide on things that are impossible, so decision and wish are different. More generally, we can wish for things we can't achieve through our own agency, but we decide on things we can achieve through our own agency, or at least, if we have the help of certain friends or community members, then we could do it. We can decide on that sort of thing. We could do it by ourselves or with help. Then we could decide to do it. If it's just not possible, if we couldn't ever do it, no matter how much help we had, then we can't decide on it. We can wish for it, but we can't decide on it. Okay, and then we get into this long discussion at some point about whether decision is belief. And I'm not going to belabor that. I'm not going to do the whole discussion because you probably didn't think decision was belief anyway. But why is he making the distinction? Well, beliefs play a role in motivation. That's why. And beliefs play a role in decision, and beliefs play a role in deliberation. So it is important to distinguish these different components. One thing I would say that Aristotle doesn't say is that beliefs aren't directly motivational, or they're, well, I would stick to that. I'll say beliefs are not directly motivational. So if Aristotle had framed the discussion in terms of motivational states, I think he could have just said that. Well, belief isn't intrinsically a motivational state, and he could have left it at that. So I'll offer that to you as something to chew on. If you were really wondering whether a decision is some kind of belief, I would invite you to think about how beliefs aren't intrinsically motivational, but they get hooked up to desires that we have. We can decide on something, and then our beliefs will play a role in how we pursue the object of the decision, right? Or even prior to that, we already know, since I jumped the gun, that decision depends on a process of deliberation. When we're deliberating, our beliefs play a role in laying out the steps that we'll take to reach the object of decision, right? When we deliberate, we come up with this process for achieving some goal, some end. Our beliefs play a strong role in setting that up, right? I believe this is the best way to achieve this end, so that's what I'm going to do in step 3. Right? But the beliefs themselves aren't directly motivational. The only caveat I would offer there is, well, you could have a belief that something is good or that something is bad, but I don't think it's the belief that's the issue. I think it's the recognition of something as good or bad. It's like a perception, but it's not a perception. I think that's actually the issue. Your belief is based on some kind of intuition or recognition that something is good or bad, and that's motivational, right? When you intuit that something is good, then you have a wish for it, and now you want it, right? And that's a very direct line of causation. But beliefs by themselves tend to shape how we go about getting what we want, rather than directly telling us what we want. I don't think that's quite how it works. But one of the things that Aristotle does say, just to use his argumentation here a little bit, is the people who make the best decisions and those who have the best beliefs are not the same people. And that seems right. That's a good point. In other words, you can be theoretically in the right and just be vicious, right? You could know ethical theory backward and forward and make really bad decisions and pursue terrible outcomes, right? And we know that That's why some people are skeptical of ethics, I think. You can have lots of ethical knowledge, and then because of vice, right? In other words, because you just have this tendency to give in to these desires that aren't good, which would be a condition of vice. You'd have to be habituated to do that, right? You can be weak at first, but when you get to the point where you have a tendency to give in to bad desires rather than struggle with them and fight them and then overcome them, that is a state of vice where you've sort of habituated yourself to give in. So you could have wonderful, great, excellent knowledge, you could have the best teachers, you could have read all the right books, and then you just do terrible things and you make terrible decisions, right? So that's why he says the people who have the best beliefs and the people who make the best decisions aren't the same people. And he's not saying there isn't any overlap. You know, of course you could have really good knowledge of ethics and make really great decisions. He's not ruling that out. He's just saying some people don't have a lot of theoretical interests and they're not going to read a book on ethics, but man, they make great decisions. They're living a good life. And then on the other side, you've got these people who are very learned and they've read all the books and they know all these things, and you can see them living a life of vice. So there can be an overlap, people who are really knowledgeable and well-read and make good decisions, but also these categories aren't the same. There's some kind of Venn diagram that we could do where there's an intersection between them, but they're different categories. Okay. So then finally at the end of chapter 2, Aristotle says, well, perhaps what is decided is what has been previously deliberated. That makes sense anyway. I don't want to argue about it. Aristotle gives one of his etymological arguments. We don't need to get into that. It just makes sense, right? You know what decision is. You know what the word means. You decided. There was some kind of moment where, you know, you went from being undecided to decided, and you know that it involved looking at considerations. That's all built into the word decision. So we don't need an etymological inquiry here. We can rely on meaning without doing that. So you went from an undecided state to a decided state, and the word itself indicates that there were some considerations there that pushed you over, that pushed you from undecided to decided. So it looks like you went through a process of deliberation, because a process of deliberation involves looking at the different considerations and weighing pros and cons, right? So decision seems to follow from deliberation. So what do we deliberate about? Well, we get a list of things we don't deliberate about right at the beginning, and I should say these chapters are pretty cut up for you, and so I could be saying things that aren't in the chapter as you have it, but these considerations that I'm looking at, they come from a full unabridged version of the text, right? And so if I'm telling you something about the text that you didn't read, it's probably been lopped out, okay? But that's okay. I want to give you a full picture here as much as I can. Okay, so like I said, we do get this list of things that we don't deliberate about right at first. We don't deliberate about eternal things, nor about the completely universal or necessary, nor about things that could fall under general law but aren't totally fixed in their nature, like the weather. In other words, there are general considerations that determine what's going to happen with the weather. And we don't you know, generally speaking, we don't deliberate about that. It's not something under our purview, so we don't deliberate about it. And we don't deliberate about fortune, the results of fortune. Right? Or putting the whole thing a different way, part of this chapter tells us what the causes are. In other words, there are different categories of cause. And so causes include nature, necessity, fortune, and mind, right? And so 3 of those aren't up to us, and so they're not anything we deliberate about, right? That is to say, we don't deliberate about whether gravity is going to work today, and we don't deliberate about how strong a force it's going to be, because that's nature, and there's nothing we can do. We don't deliberate about whether 2 + 2 = 4, because necessarily 2 + 2 = 4. So that's how necessity differs from nature. Some things within nature might seem necessary, and maybe Aristotle would allow that. But if we're trying to think of something that's necessary but doesn't have to do with physical nature, well, then we're in the conceptual realm. We're dealing with something like math or geometry or basic argument form, which is fixed, necessarily. If it's the case that if A then B, and it's the case that A, then it is also the case that B, right? That's modus ponens, that's a basic argument form, right? So that's just another bit of necessity. And then there's fortune, which we read about elsewhere. Sometimes things happen coincidentally, right? And there's a good outcome that couldn't have been expected. And if it couldn't have been expected, then we can't deliberate about it, right? So again, nature, necessity, fortune, and mind. We can't deliberate about nature, necessity, and fortune. We can deliberate about mind, right? That is to say, we can deliberate about things that are up to us and actions that we can do. Right? So we deliberate about what results from our own agency, or what can result from our own agency. But as Aristotle says, we deliberate about what has different results on different occasions. We deliberate more about disciplines that are less exactly worked out. In other words, trying to think of examples here, you don't deliberate about how to start the car because that's relatively fixed. These days I do press a button to start my car, but at least that's fixed with respect to my particular car. So I don't deliberate about that. I don't deliberate about how to get to work anymore. So this might be a fruitful case for us, right? I ride my bike typically to Regis University, and I have the path all worked out. So it's fixed, but it wasn't always fixed. At one point, more than one point, I looked at a map and I thought about, where I could go on my bike. Is this a good road for me to take my bike on or not? And I mapped it out, and it has changed a couple of times. So that's the sort of thing he's talking about. That's the sort of thing you deliberate about. Not something relatively fixed, like how to start the car, or, if I get a flat tire, how do I repair it? Well, there's a pretty set process for that. But if I'm going to take it to a shop, I might deliberate about which shop is best, who's got the best mechanics, where am I going to get the best price. So that's a good example for us as well. I don't deliberate about spelling. I try to remember how to spell. Right? He does mention spelling, and that's the sense in which he mentions it. Well, we wouldn't deliberate about that because there's a sort of collective agreement on how to spell things, and it's in the dictionary, for us at least, and we could just look it up. Right, so that's a relatively fixed thing. Not that spellings never change, but relatively that's fixed. But we could deliberate about how to compose an essay, right? Because it's different every time. You have a different audience for different essays. You're trying to achieve different things. You're trying to prove different things. So deliberation matters a great deal there. And I do deliberate about my lectures, right? How am I going to do this? What am I going to focus on? Right? I already told you at the beginning what I wasn't going to talk about. That was the result of deliberation. And I was sharing what I had decided based on a process of deliberation that I went through, thinking, well, it would be good to focus on this, and therefore I'll omit this and I won't cover it, right? Okay, so that should make sense. We don't deliberate about ends, but about what promotes ends, Aristotle says. We've suggested this already. We want something, we wish for something, that's our end, that's our goal. The process of deliberation takes that for granted. And Aristotle's not saying we could never deliberate about something that becomes an end for us. He's not saying that. He's saying in a given process of deliberation, the end is fixed, right? But in general, we could think about whether something is really good for us, right? And then we could determine that it is good for us. I don't know if we quite want to call that a decision, because we're not deciding to do, which is what Aristotle thinks decision is for, deciding to do. But we can do something like deliberation with respect to our wants, our desires, and we could say, well, that's not good for us because of such and such reason, but that would be good for us to pursue, right? It's not clear that that's a decision yet, right? It's certainly not, if we go by Aristotle's strict definition. The definition involves going through a process of deliberation about how to achieve an end. So if we're thinking about what's really good for us and what's not good for us, that would seem to be a separate thing. That would seem to be a kind of inquiry, right, that results in a conclusion, but not exactly a decision. Okay, so anyway, back to what Aristotle thinks. We deliberate about how to get the end that we've already laid down, and the end was laid down through wish, typically, right? Maybe there's some other possibilities, but typically it's about wish. It's about recognizing something that's good. We've intuited its goodness, so we're going to pursue that. How do we do it? How do we go about the process of deliberation? Well, if there are different means to achieve the end or the goal, we looked for the most efficient, what costs us the least and what will be quick. Those are considerations of efficiency, but we also consider what's finest. Maybe we'll be able to exercise virtue in pursuing the end in this way rather than in this way. So we're going to take the fine and the efficient into account as we sort out which means to employ. Typically, we can get the goal, we can get the end in different ways. So we got to figure out what the best means are. And again, efficiency and fineness are both considerations there. When a mean is selected, or if there's only one of them, if there's only one means to achieve what we want, then we look for how to achieve that means. Okay, so we've got the goal, Then we think about the best means to get the goal. Then we think about the best means to get that means. Then we back up again and think about the best means for getting the means here, for getting the means that's most close to the goal, for getting the goal, right? We keep backing up the means to the means to the means to the means to the means until what? Well, until we come to an action that we can do. Right, so goal, means to goal, means to means to goal, means to means to means to goal, means to means to means to means to goal. Oh, we could do this one. This means is an action that I can do. Okay, execute. Let's do it. Right? So what you do is you follow the path that you traced, but now you go in the opposite direction. So goal means, back up into a means that's an action that you can do, and then go trace the same path in the opposite direction. Okay, hope that well, I think that makes sense. So as Aristotle puts it, we deliberate about and decide on the same things, but by the time we decide to do it, it is definite. While we were deliberating, it was indefinite. We were working it out. But we get to a point where we realize we can do this thing, and it will lead to a chain of steps if we keep going with it. That will get us our goal. And so now we act. Now it's definite, right? And so I will quote Aristotle here, but again, this is not your translation, but it will be helpful to sum up what we've been saying. We have found then that what we decide to do is whatever action among those up to us we deliberate about and consequently desire to do. So deliberation leads to this rational desire to do this action. And that's what decision is. It's the rational desire to do the action that resulted from deliberation. Hence, also decision will be deliberative desire to do an action that is up to us. For when we have judged that it is right, as a result of deliberation, we desire to do it in accord with our wish. Right? Because the whole thing was predicated on some wish that you had. So to sum up the summary, decision is a deliberative desire, meaning it's a desire caused by a process of deliberation. It also is caused by the wish that initiated the process of deliberation. We desire to do it in accord with our wish. So we had a wish that kicked us into a deliberative process. What's the means to achieve this thing I wish for? What's the means to that means? What's the means to that means to that means? And so on. We reached some action we could do. We desired to do it. The desire sort of transferred from the wish through the deliberative process to the decision. So now we have this deliberative desire, this decision to do it. And again, we execute unless there's an impediment. Okay. And then the chapter on wish, I wouldn't want to get us bogged down there. So let's just say we already know what wish is. The chapter on wish poses a puzzle. The puzzle about wish that Aristotle wants to raise in chapter 4 has to do with whether wish is for the good, for what is actually good, or whether wish is instead for the apparent good or what appears to be good. Okay? It seems to cause trouble, whichever one we choose. So let's talk about the trouble. Okay? So suppose that wishes are for the good. That's what you genuinely really wish for, what is actually good. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, here's what it would entail, and that helps us understand what it means. Take the hedonist, for example. Now, the hedonist believes that pleasure is the highest good, and the hedonist lives his or her life accordingly, right? And if you asked the hedonist, what do you wish for? The hedonist might say, I wish for 20 or 30 or 40 more years of pleasure. Whatever I got left, I want to fill that time with maximum pleasure, right? So suppose wish is for what's actually good, right? Then we have to say that the hedonist doesn't really wish for pleasure. Now, the hedonist says, I wish for more pleasure, maximum pleasure as long as I live. But if wish is for the good, if that's its proper object, then the hedonist is wrong, at least by Aristotle's lights. The hedonist doesn't have the wish that he or she thinks he or she has. Okay, so we get that right. That's on the strict reading of wishes for the good. It can't have any other object. That's its proper object. That's what it's really aimed at. We may not know what our wishes are aimed at in certain cases, and that's what's going on with the hedonist. That person doesn't know that pleasure is not the good, and that a life based around pleasure is in fact bad, right? And they don't actually wish for that. They don't actually want that. That's a really basic mistake to make. And you can imagine the hedonist 10 years from now, saying, yeah, I still want more pleasure. I want maximum pleasure. I mean, some people just really stick with it, right? And they keep espousing hedonism over long stretches of time. And so that's a little problematic then, right? So on the view that wish is actually for the good, or what's actually good even, we have this problem that the hedonist, doesn't actually know what he or she wishes for. In fact, thinks they have a fundamental wish, for pleasure, more pleasure, all throughout life. Thinks they have a wish that they don't actually have. So that seems like a problem. So maybe we don't want to go that route. Maybe we don't want to say wishes for the good. So, okay, let's say that wish is for the apparent good. Is that better? Well, that raises a different problem. If wish is for the apparent good, then I can't make any mistakes about what I wish for. Right? So if wish is for the good, for what's actually good, I could be radically, fundamentally mistaken about my own wishes, and that seems weird. But then, on the other side, wish is for the apparent good, then whatever appears good to you at any given time, you actually wish for, and you couldn't really make a mistake, right? If wish is for the apparent good. So, for example, suppose I wish for a pony, or at least that's what I tell you. I want a pony. I want to ride a pony around, and they're cute, so I want one, okay? So I get a pony, and I put the pony in my backyard, and I very quickly realize my yard isn't big enough for this pony. This pony is unhappy and uncomfortable in my backyard. Also, the pony can't run around and, is pooping in the yard, and it's a lot of poop, and this is stinking things up. And you can imagine me saying, I thought I wished for a pony, but I didn't. That's not what I actually wanted. But if wish is for the apparent good, then I did wish for the pony when the pony appeared good. And now I don't wish for the pony now, but I did wish for the pony then. But we do think you could make some mistakes about your wishes. You could just mischaracterize the thing that you're wishing for. That's what I'm doing in this scenario. I'm not realizing how cramped the pony will be, and I'm not realizing the mess and the stink that will be produced by the pony. I just haven't thought it through. So it makes sense for us to say, I didn't actually wish for the pony. I didn't have a good conception of what I was wishing for, so I didn't wish for the pony. But if wish is for the apparent good, then it seems like we should say, well, the pony appeared good earlier, so I did wish for the pony. Now I don't, but I did, right? So I can't make any mistakes about my wishes if wish is for the apparent good. And that doesn't work either. So if wish is for the good, I could be fundamentally, radically mistaken about my own wishes, and that's weird. If wish is for the apparent good, I can't make any mistakes about my wishes, and that also seems weird, right? So what's an Aristotle to do? Well, he ends up combining the views by appealing to the virtuous person. Okay, so the virtuous person is in a good condition. So what appears good to the virtuous person is actually good. So Aristotle makes the good and the apparent good collapse into each other. And if that's the case, then we don't need to worry about mistakes and regrets, because the virtuous person is getting it right. So that sounds maybe at first like it doesn't solve the problem, because we did have problems on either side of it, but the problems on either side involved mistakes, right? It seemed like on the one hand, right, we wouldn't want to say that was just a mistake that the hedonist was making, and then on the other hand, we wanted to say, well, that is a mistake that I made about the pony, and now we've just gotten rid of mistakes. Right? So you may not like the solution, but it is in fact a solution to the problem that was raised. Right? So that's Aristotle's resolution to the puzzle. To make it a little stronger, to give it a little more grounding, he makes a comparison to the healthy person versus the sick person. Right? So the healthy person enjoys nutritious food and a healthy environment. The sick person has perceptions that are askew, let's say. And, food that's perfectly good could taste bitter or bland to the sick person who's in a bad condition. And, open air and sunlight might seem problematic to the sick person. They don't want to feel exposed to the sun, maybe. Sometimes I'm that way, depending on what kind of sickness I have, right? I just kind of want to hide under the covers. So the healthy person has good perceptions, and so, we can apply that to the virtuous person. Well, the virtuous person is the one with healthy dispositions, and so they see things rightly. Now, the sick person is parallel to the vicious person. The vicious person is in a bad state. So the vicious person might wish for bad things, right? And that's okay in this way of thinking, right? Because Aristotle is saying that's a deviant case. So we were worried about people wishing for the apparent good, and it was causing problems. Now it's sort of isolated in a way. So for the healthy person, the good and the apparent good have collapsed into each other. And then we've got this deviant sort of case where you've got a vicious person who might wish for the apparent good and will allow that. Yeah, they're making a mistake, and why are they making a mistake? It's because they're in an unhealthy state, because they're in a state of vice, right? So ethically or spiritually unhealthy, right? Excuse me. So Aristotle is fine with that. It doesn't seem to cause any problems. You kind of want to say, well, of course, that person is making a mistake, pursuing the apparent good. That person is in a bad state anyway, right? And so that does apply to the hedonist, right? So you might think a problem remains, but to his own satisfaction, Aristotle has solved it. Well, the hedonist is just vicious and has bad perceptions, and that's fine. They're pursuing the apparent good, and that good is going to continue to appear good to them 10 years down the road if they don't fundamentally change things, right? So at least we know what to expect, right? It seemed weird at first that the hedonist might stick with this huge mistake, but once we associate this with the state of vice, which is a state that one gets into slowly and it requires habituation, and so it's sort of reinforced. It's self-reinforced in the way that virtue is. I think I've mentioned this before, but maybe not in these terms. The state of virtue disposes us to do good actions, and doing good actions habituates us to do good actions with good motivations. So virtue is self-reinforcing in that way, but then so is vice, right? If you do bad actions and develop bad habits, then you've learned to do bad actions with bad motivations, right? And that further inculcates the habits that were problematic to begin with. And so vice is a self-reinforcing state. So once we put the hedonist into that category and we say that's why the hedonist has bad perceptions, that does help Aristotle, right? We've explained what was somewhat puzzling, or part of the puzzle that we were having. Well, the hedonist really sticks with that appearance. Yeah, the hedonist is vicious, is in a self-reinforcing state of vice. So that helps to explain it. Okay, well now we're on to chapter 5. I'm going to lay out the initial argument for you. Right off the bat, we get an argument to show that virtue is up to us. I'll even number the premises for you. Premise number 1, we lay down the end and then deliberate and decide about things that promote the end. That's by definition, that sounds right. Premise number 2, sub-conclusion, but also a premise. Thus we decide on actions that promote the end, for actions are often means to an end, right? Premise number 3, furthermore, the activity of virtue consists of precisely such things, namely actions that promote the end. And then final conclusion, so virtue is up to us, hence vice is up to us as well. That's the full argument. Let's go over it again more briefly. So we have an end that we wish for. We deliberate about it, how we're going to achieve it. This leads to a decision, right? Virtue itself consists of deciding on actions to promote an end, right? Therefore, virtue is up to us, hence vice is as well, right? Now, of course, having said that, was your end any good, right? And so that's, to some extent, that's what the rest of the chapter is about, right? So virtue is up to us because virtue involves taking an end and deciding how to achieve it through a process of deliberation. How do I achieve that end? Well, I have to achieve it in a fine way if I'm going to be virtuous. But was the end any good? Well, let's talk about that as we continue through the chapter. There's also an argument that explains why vice is up to us if virtue is. The argument goes like this. Premise 1, if acting when that is fine is up to us, so is not acting when that is shameful. Right? Right? It could be a fine thing to do the action, right? And we've already argued that that's up to us. But then we could just as well not, if we could do the action, then we could just as well not do the action. And by stipulation, it's shameful. If doing the action is fine, then not doing it is shameful. By fine, we mean noble and virtuous and all that, right? So if doing it is up to us and that's noble and fine, then not doing the action must be up to us as well, and then that's shameful. And so then the shameful thing in that situation is up to us. And then if not acting when that is fine or noble is up to us, then so is acting when that is by stipulation shameful. Right? And that should make sense because I already explained the first premise. Premise 3, and pursuing the fine is up to us according to the argument we already gave. Premise 4, doing fine or shameful actions is what it is to be a good or bad person. Over time, that's true. Right? It's actually not necessarily true in the moment, but over time, as we continue to do fine actions, we develop virtue. Right? So doing fine actions over time is what it is to be a good person. Doing shameful actions over time is what it is to be a bad person. That creates the state of character. 5, main conclusion. Therefore, being a good or bad person is up to us. Being a base or decent person is up to us. Okay, so we know virtue is up to us because it involves laying down an end and trying to achieve it, right? And we could give examples. You're trying to face danger. How do I face this danger? Here's the best way to do it, right? Go through a process of deliberation, and I stick to what I've deliberated about and decided on, right? Maybe courage isn't the best example because often I have to act courageously in the moment, but I can decide ahead of time before I get on the battlefield how I'll comport myself. Temperance is a better area for examples that can occur in the moment. Somebody offers me a second piece of rich, luscious, delicious chocolate cake. I do have some time to deliberate quickly about whether this is a good idea and is going to help me achieve my nutritional goals, and I quickly decide it isn't, and I stick to that. So the argument makes sense on the face of it. The only caveat is still, well, did I start with a good end or goal in the first place, right? And then, if virtue is up to us, vice must be, because virtue either involves doing something or not doing something. Right? If doing something is the virtuous thing, and it's up to me, then I could just as well not do it. Otherwise, it's not really up to me. So I could not do it. So then doing the shameful thing, or not doing something, and that being shameful, that's up to me. Right? And so on. So you get the idea. Right? So these arguments are near the beginning of the chapter, and then as Aristotle says, if these conclusions are faulty, then we have to deny that a human being is a principle, meaning we have to deny that humans ever cause their own actions. Somehow they have to cause their own actions, we think, And we've given a sort of best case scenario where they recognize the goodness of something and so they wish for it, and then they go through a process of deliberation, and then they decide on some action that will ultimately bring about the thing they wished for. That's our best case scenario, right? If people are really in control of themselves, that would be sort of the paradigm case. So if we deny that these things are true, that we've been thinking about, if we deny that virtue is really about, choosing an action, or if we deny that deliberative choice or decision and deliberation are up to us, if we deny that sort of thing, we're taking away agency from human beings, which we could do. Some people do go that route of determinism. But it's good to point it out. We're doing ethics, right? And so there's a built-in premise that we could do better. We could live our lives better, right? And so basically, if you don't allow the paradigm case where wish and deliberation and decision that follows from deliberation are all up to us and can promote virtue, if you deny all that, you seem to be taking away our ethical agency, so there's no point in doing ethics. Some of you might be relieved, but you should be worried, right? Seems like we need ethics to help us do better. And then, in that vein, Aristotle mentions legislators. What we're talking about seems to be assumed by legislators. They think they can encourage good behavior and discourage bad behavior, right? They think they can give out honors and awards to discourage They think they can give out honors and awards to encourage good behavior. They think they can mete out punishments to discourage bad behavior, right? Also, legislators impose corrective treatments for ignorance sometimes, right? So legislators assume actions are up to us by encouraging and discouraging, but also they try to correct problematic ignorance, right? Like when you have to go to traffic school or driving school because you got some points on your license, or you have to take anger management classes, right? A judge could order that. They think things are up to you, and they do tend to follow something like Aristotle's model of voluntary action, right? You could be excused for some kinds of ignorance, but other kinds of ignorance are problematic, and correction will be imposed. Right? Okay. The rest of the chapter, after Aristotle mentions legislators, is taken up with possible objections to his view, and then Aristotle handles the objections, right? So we might object by saying, you're telling us we should know this and that, we should have this and that ethical knowledge, but maybe we were inattentive, maybe we weren't paying adequate attention. We might say something like that. And then Aristotle says, rightly, well, it's up to you what you pay attention to. You know that, certain things you could argue about, but it is largely up to you what you get to pay attention to. So you can't excuse yourself by saying I wasn't paying attention. Okay. You might say, I didn't know I would become vicious by doing vicious actions. I didn't know I would become unjust by doing unjust actions. I didn't know I would become intemperate by doing intemperate actions. I didn't know I'd acquire vice with my bad habits. So I made lots of bad decisions over time, and now I have a vicious character and it's hard to deal with, and I didn't know all of that. And then Aristotle says that's a fairly basic point, that intemperate actions over time will cause intemperance, or externally intemperate actions over time will cause intemperance. Externally ungenerous actions over time will cause ungenerosity, and so on. That's a fairly obvious point. You should have known, right? Certain kinds of ignorance are excusable, and some kinds aren't. You should know what's universal and beneficial, and this seems to be one of those things. Sort of in the same vein, Aristotle says, you could object that you wish to be just and you wish to be virtuous, and your wishes aren't effective. And that's fair as far as it goes. Your wish to be good, your wish to be virtuous won't be immediately effective. But that's like making yourself sick because you were doing things you shouldn't have. You were out all night drinking, say. And now you're sick. You caught something and you're hungover. And you feel terrible, right? And you say, well, I wish to be well, but I'm not well. Okay, well, it takes time, right? So you wish to be virtuous, and you're not yet virtuous. Well, it takes time. It took you time to get into the bad state of vice, of sickness. It'll take you time to get out of the bad state. So it's true that your wish to be good and just won't immediately be effective, but it won't get you off the hook because you put yourself in a bad condition that makes your wish ineffective. And also, if you keep working, you can gain some virtue. Okay, another objection is everyone pursues the apparent good, right? And then it's not really up to us what appears to us as good. Well, that's partly true. It's got some truth to it, but it's not completely true. And this came up in the chapter on wish. In the moment, it's not up to you how things appear and what appears good and what appears bad. In the moment, that's not up to you. But over time, it is, because you can attain virtue. You can get into a good condition. And then, like I said, like I put it with respect to the last chapter, the distinction between the good and the apparent good will collapse, and what appears good will actually be good once you've done the work and you're in a good state, right? Okay, so then the next objection seems really important then, given what we just said. But, supposing those appearances really are fixed, and they are fixed in the moment, but Aristotle also imagines, well, what if the appearances are fixed by nature? What if your brain works a certain way? What if your soul works a certain way? What if you can't help but see these things as good and those things as bad, and it's wrong and it's flawed? Well, according to our argumentation so far, actions are still up to us, and we can still do correct action, and by doing that we can develop a disposition to do good action. So we can still develop something like virtue and avoid something like vice. And I say something like because it's sort of built into Aristotle's definition of virtue that it affects the appearances. But supposing that weren't the case, you can still develop good habits. What you need is a little humility. You need to realize that your appearances aren't determinative of reality. You can get things wrong. And then you get help from other people. You try to ask them, well, what could I do better? I think this is good advice in general. If you want to do better and be a better person, you could directly ask someone who knows you well and say, just tell me the unvarnished truth and let me hear it. And then in this specific scenario, you could use that to begin to do good actions and develop better habits. Okay, so we've overcome all the objections that Aristotle mentions. So Aristotle is entitled to conclude that virtue and vice are both voluntary, right? We are responsible for our states of character, and our characters determine the sorts of ends we lay down. So that's the caveat from the beginning. Remember, I mentioned the caveat, well, really a couple of caveats. We lay down the end, and then we deliberate about how to achieve it, and then we decide on a specific action that will allow us to start achieving it. And that's what we do to be virtuous. We lay down the end and we work toward achieving it. And so, since deliberation and decision are up to us, so is virtue. And then the caveat was, well, did we lay down a good end? And then the caveat has been addressed. Over time, our perceptions will change, and we will better track what is actually good. And then we will lay down good ends. And then, remember in the other argument about, the connection between virtue and vice, well, if virtue is up to us, then so is vice. That had a premise in it that said doing fine or shameful actions is what it is to be a good or bad person. It's really the same issue coming up again. Well, if you're just externally following the motions, that's not what it is to be a good person. But over time, your perceptions will change. If you keep externally doing good actions, you will internalize a desire to do what's good. Fake it till you make it. Okay. So not only have we overcome objections, but we've also sort of patched up those initial arguments that had some little gaps in them, right? And now they seem even more compelling. So I'll leave you with that thought. Virtue and vice are up to us. And then remember, that means that the bulk of happiness is up to us, which is a really great finding. Now that we've done all this work in ethical theory, that is a great thing to find out. So we'll all walk away from this working on our happiness. All right, thank you.